Settle in and let the day loosen its grip. Tonight's story begins in a hospice office in western Pennsylvania, where the morning rain made soft tracks down the windows, and a nurse named Eli Mercer found a patient nobody else wanted to visit twice. The patient's name was Walter Bell. He was 82, widowed, living alone above a closed hardware store, and dying of pancreatic cancer. In the referral notes, one sentence appeared 3 times in 3 different forms: difficult personality, limited support, estranged family. The last nurse had added a 4th note in blue ink. Patient completes crossword puzzles in pen, does not tolerate guesses. Eli read that line twice and smiled. He was 39, broad-shouldered, quiet, and 6 years into hospice nursing after a decade in a hospital intensive care unit. He had learned that charts describe symptoms more accurately than people. Difficult could mean frightened. Non-compliant could mean nobody had explained the choices. Estranged family could contain an entire lifetime between 2 words. He closed the chart, took a fresh symptom kit from the locked cabinet, and drove through the rain toward Bell's Hardware. There is no villain in this story. There are only people who waited too long. People who mistook silence for safety. And one nurse who understood that comfort sometimes begins with pain medicine, and sometimes begins by noticing the empty square in a crossword. Bell's Hardware had occupied the corner of Walnut and 3rd for 73 years. The painted sign remained above the windows, though brown paper covered the displays, and the front door had not opened to customers in nearly a decade. A narrow green door beside the shop led to the apartment upstairs. Walter answered after Eli's 3rd knock. He wore pressed trousers, a white undershirt, and one suspender fastened while the other hung loose. His hair was silver and combed straight back. He looked at Eli's hospice badge, then at the rein on Eli's shoulders. "Shoes," Walter said. Eli looked down. "Wet?" "On the mat, unless the agency also provides floor refinishing." Eli left his shoes beside the door and climbed the stairs in his socks. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon oil, old books, and toast. Every surface was orderly. The furniture belonged to several decades at once, maintained so carefully that nothing had ever been forced to retire. A walnut record cabinet stood against one wall beneath a turntable covered by a clear plastic lid. Beside the recliner lay a folded newspaper and a crossword filled almost completely in blue ink. Walter caught Eli looking at it. 7 down is wrong in today's edition. "What's the clue?" "Mediterranean port, 4 letters. They want Bari. The crossing letter makes it Biri, which is not a place unless the Italians moved it overnight." "Maybe the crossing answer is wrong." Walter stared at him. "You can put your shoes back on." Eli sat instead. His first job was not to charm Walter. It was to assess pain, nausea, breathing, medication safety, food, mobility, and whether the man understood what hospice could and could not provide. Eli asked permission before every examination. Walter answered in clipped syllables and corrected the pronunciation of 3 drug names, even though Eli had pronounced them correctly. The pain was worse than Walter admitted. Eli saw it in the shallow breathing and the way Walter braced before standing. The prescribed medication sat nearly untouched on the kitchen counter. "It makes me foggy," Walter said. "How much did you take?" "1 dose." "And then?" "I disliked it." Eli nodded. "We can adjust. Hospice isn't a contract requiring you to feel drugged. The goal is enough relief to let you be yourself, not so much that you disappear before you're ready." Walter studied him, suspicious of any sentence that sounded prepared. "And if the pain gets worse?" "You call us, day or night. We change the plan with you." People say day or night when they mean office hours plus an answering service. Eli took the hospice phone from his pocket, dialed the after-hours number, and placed it on speaker. A nurse named Denise answered on the 2nd ring. Eli apologized, explained it was a demonstration, and let Walter ask what would happen at 2 in the morning. Denise answered without impatience. Walter wrote her name on the margin of the newspaper. That was the first inch of trust. The second came when Eli noticed a blister pack of medication with dates in tiny print. Walter's eyesight was good enough for a crossword, but not for gray lettering on foil. Eli used a black marker to label morning and evening in large letters, then set up a written schedule without moving anything from its assigned place. "You don't reorganize a man's kitchen on the first visit," Walter said. "That usually isn't in the care plan." "Last person put the tea beside the coffee." Criminal. Walter's mouth moved at one corner, not quite a smile. Before leaving, Eli asked whom the hospice should call in an emergency. Walter named his neighbor downstairs, Mrs. Alvarez, who managed the tax office next door and checked on him every evening. The chart listed a son named Daniel, address unknown. "And Daniel?" Eli asked. Walter's face closed with astonishing speed. "Not involved." "Understood." Eli did not ask why. A dying person was not a locked drawer he had been hired to force open. At the door, Walter pointed toward the newspaper. "Sorry." "Excuse me?" The crossing answer. Garment from India, 4 letters. Sorry. That makes Bari correct. I had the error. Eli picked up his shoes. "Good thing you used pen." Walter looked offended until Eli reached the stairs. Then, behind him, came a sound like one dry cough. It took Eli a moment to recognize it as a laugh. He visited again 2 days later. Walter opened the door before the second knock and said the new medication dose was acceptable, by which he meant his pain had fallen from an 8 to a 4. He had eaten soup. He had also completed 2 crosswords and placed the harder one on the table nearest Eli's chair. The clue at 17 across read, "One who remains," 6 letters. "Stayer," Eli said. Walter shook his head. 5. "You said 6. Walter checked the grid. "The paper says 6. "Maybe friend." Sentimental and unsupported by crossings. They worked around it while Eli checked vital signs. The word turned out to be keeper, which Walter disliked because the clue was imprecise. He wrote a letter to the editor while Eli counted pills. Over the next 3 weeks, their visits developed a shape. Eli arrived on Monday and Thursday afternoons. Walter complained about the parking authority, television meteorologists, seedless watermelon, and any crossword clue containing a question mark. Eli checked symptoms, arranged refills, coordinated with the social worker, and listened without treating complaint as pathology. Walter had owned the hardware store below. His father opened it after returning from the war, and Walter began sweeping floors at 9. He knew the diameter of every pipe in the building and could identify a screw by the sound it made dropped on the counter. Years after his wife Miriam died, he finally sold the remaining inventory, but he could not sell the building. "Buyers want to make the shop into exposed brick and coffee," he said. "They expose the brick, hang 3 light bulbs, and charge $6 for water poured through beans." A public menace. At last, a medical professional with judgment. Photographs stood on the piano. Walter and Miriam on their wedding day, both laughing at something outside the frame. A boy in a Little League uniform. The same boy at high school graduation, taller than Walter. Then the photographs stopped. Eli never saw Daniel's adult face. One afternoon, rain trapped gray light against the windows, and Walter's nausea would not settle. Eli called the hospice physician, adjusted medication under the standing orders, and stayed until the worst passed. Walter slept for 20 minutes in the recliner. When he woke, his gaze went to the record cabinet. "Miriam played those," he said. "What did she like?" "Everything I pretended not to. Ella Fitzgerald, Sam Cooke, Carole King. Opera when she wanted me out of the room." "Does the turntable work?" "Of course it works." "Do you play it?" Walter looked toward the dustless plastic cover. "No." Eli let the silence sit. Then he returned to the medication chart. At the end of the visit, Walter said, "The first record we bought together was Kind of Blue. She said it would make the apartment sophisticated. We lived above a laundromat and had 1 chair." "Did it work?" "No, but it made the laundromat sound better." On Thursday, the album waited on top of the cabinet. Eli did not mention that Walter had placed it there. He washed his hands, checked the new nausea patch, and asked whether the turntable belt might have dried out. Walter replied that belts did not dry out when properly maintained, then lifted the plastic cover with the care of a museum curator. The record descended. The needle found the groove. A soft crackle moved through the room before the first notes opened like a door. Walter sat absolutely still. Eli busied himself at the kitchen table, giving the man privacy without leaving him alone. Near the end of the first track, Walter spoke. Daniel hated trumpet. Eli waited. He said it sounded like somebody arguing through a drain pipe. Miriam told him that was because he was 13 and had no soul yet. Did he acquire one later? Unclear. The record played through one side. Walter did not ask to turn it over. The next Monday, Eli arrived to find the crossword unfinished. 3 corners were blank. Walter had never before left 1 corner blank, much less 3. His pain had climbed over the weekend, and he had been vomiting. Mrs. Alvarez had offered to call hospice, but Walter told her not to bother anyone. Eli was gentle and direct. Calling us is not bothering us. Waiting until you're miserable makes our job harder and your day worse. Those are the only 2 outcomes. I thought it would pass. You were wrong. Walter's eyebrows rose. We established on my first visit that this can happen even in pen. Walter looked at the crossword and conceded the point. Eli arranged a same-day visit from the physician, changed the medication plan, and requested a hospital bed for the room beside the windows. Walter objected to the word hospital and to moving his walnut coffee table. Eli found a compromise. The bed would arrive but remain against the far wall until needed, and the coffee table would shift beside the piano rather than leave the apartment. The hospice social worker, Priya Shah, came that afternoon. She spoke with Walter about practical matters, advance directives, funeral home preferences, finances, and who had authority if he could no longer speak for himself. Walter had completed most documents years earlier. Mrs. Alvarez held a spare key. A local attorney served as executor. There was still the blank where a family contact might have been. Priya asked about Daniel once. Walter said no. She moved on. Afterward, Walter accused the hospice team of coordinating an interrogation. Priya asked one question, Eli said. She asked it professionally. That's worse. Then answer unprofessionally. Walter stared at the record cabinet. He left. All right. That's the answer. Then that's the answer. Walter seemed annoyed that Eli did not demand the rest. A week later, he supplied it anyway. They were doing the Sunday crossword on a Wednesday because Walter had been too tired Sunday. The clue was old wound, 4 letters. Walter immediately wrote scar. Daniel wanted to be a musician, he said. Eli kept his eyes on the grid. What kind? The kind with no health insurance. Guitar. Songs. He was good enough to make the mistake plausible. Daniel had been 22, recently finished with college, and invited to join a touring band based in Nashville. Walter wanted him to take a position with a building supply company outside Pittsburgh. The job had benefits, a pension plan, and a future Walter could recognize. Miriam had tried to stand between them without choosing a side. Daniel took the tour. Walter called it running away. Daniel called Walter afraid of any life he could not price by the box. He wasn't entirely wrong, Walter said. The tour lasted 14 months. Daniel returned once for Christmas, thin and exhausted, carrying a guitar in a case patched with silver tape. Walter asked what his plan was. Daniel asked whether Walter had missed him. Each answered the question he wished the other had asked. Then Miriam got sick. Ovarian cancer moved quickly. Daniel came home for appointments whenever the band schedule allowed, but Walter believed it was not often enough. Daniel believed Walter used every visit to measure his absence. In the hospital corridor, after a terrible night, they said things designed to leave marks. Miriam died in February. Daniel stayed through the funeral. The morning after, he and Walter argued in the hardware store among snow shovels and furnace filters. Walter said Daniel had broken his mother's heart by treating home like a motel. Daniel said Walter had spent her illness keeping score because grief was the one thing he could not fix. Walter told him to leave. Daniel did. How long ago? Eli asked. 23 years. The room seemed to alter around that number. 23 birthdays, 23 Christmas mornings, more than 8,000 ordinary days in which either man might have picked up a telephone. No contact? A card from him the first Christmas. I returned it. A letter after 5 years. I did not answer. He called when the store closed. We spoke for 3 minutes. What happened? I asked what he wanted. Eli looked at him. Walter pressed harder with the pen. Yes. I know. Do you know where he is now? No. Do you want to? Walter filled a square that did not need filling. Finish the puzzle. They completed all but one clue. Old apology, 2 words. The crossing letters gave long overdue. Walter closed the paper. That night, Eli dreamed of his own father. Eli's father had not been cruel or absent. He was a mechanic who loved his children through oil changes, packed lunches, and emergency cash folded into birthday cards. He died of a heart attack while Eli was working an overnight shift. Their last conversation had been about brake pads. It was an ordinary conversation, and for years Eli had resented it for failing to know it was the last. He understood the temptation to turn Walter's situation into a lesson about time. But hospice patients did not exist to repair the regrets of their nurses. Daniel might be unsafe. He might not want contact. Reconciliation could not be prescribed like medication, and a peaceful death did not require a dramatic family scene. On Thursday, Eli brought no questions about Daniel. He brought ginger tea, a new crossword book with larger print, and a small brush for cleaning the turntable stylus. Walter noticed the omission. Before either man mentioned it, the oxygen delivery driver knocked downstairs. Walter had experienced 2 episodes of breathlessness during the night, and the hospice physician had ordered oxygen for comfort if he wanted it. The driver carried a concentrator up the narrow stairs while Walter objected to its size, its hum, and the implication that a machine now had permission to occupy Miriam's sewing corner. It doesn't have to stay there, Eli said. It doesn't have to stay anywhere. That's also an option, but let's test whether it helps before we hold the eviction hearing. They ran the tubing behind the recliner and placed the concentrator in the hallway, where its sound softened. Eli explained that oxygen was not a scorecard, and Walter was not required to wear it simply because it had arrived. He could use it when air hunger frightened him and leave it off when it did not help. Walter tried the nasal cannula for 3 minutes. His shoulders lowered. He hated that Eli noticed. Marginal, he said. Then we keep it for marginal emergencies. The delivery driver produced a form. Walter read every line before signing, corrected the apartment number, and asked what happened during a power outage. The driver showed him the backup cylinder. Eli watched Walter absorb the answer and realized the argument had never been about machinery. It was about being alone at 2 a.m. when breathing became work. After the driver left, Eli placed the backup where Walter could reach it without crossing the apartment. Mrs. Alvarez came upstairs to learn the setup too. Walter complained that his home had become a committee meeting, but he made her demonstrate the valve twice until he was satisfied she could use it. You trust her, Eli said after she went downstairs. She knows the difference between clockwise and counterclockwise. That is not trust. It is basic competence. Of course. Walter picked up the stylus brush. Miriam would have put a knitted cover over that machine by tomorrow. Probably flowers. Would that improve it? No. But disagreeing never stopped her from decorating an appliance. He told Eli about the winter Miriam covered the hardware store counter in paper snowflakes. Walter had said a commercial establishment was not a kindergarten. The next morning he found every hammer on the pegboard wearing a red ribbon. Customers came in only to see them. Sales rose enough that week for Miriam to order more ribbon and frame the receipt. Another memory followed. Miriam singing while counting the register. Miriam keeping a jar of loose buttons beside the cash box because people often needed one and hardware stores should sell what the neighborhood needed. Miriam slipping free furnace filters to families she knew were choosing between heat and groceries, then recording them as damaged inventory so Walter could pretend not to notice. She believed kindness worked best when nobody had to admit receiving it, Walter said. Sounds like you noticed plenty. I handled inventory. Eli had learned not to smile too quickly at Walter's softer truths. He cleaned the stylus and set the brush beside the turntable. The next visit began badly. Walter had tried to walk downstairs alone after hearing a noise in the closed shop. His right knee buckled on the fourth step. He caught the railing and lowered himself hard enough to bruise his hip, then spent nearly an hour on the landing because he refused to press the emergency pendant Priya had convinced him to wear. Mrs. Alvarez found him when she came to check the mail. By the time Eli arrived, Walter was back in the recliner, insisting nothing had happened. His face was gray with pain. The pendant lay on the table rather than around his neck. Eli assessed him for injury, called the physician, and arranged a mobile imaging visit because Walter refused the emergency department and had no signs requiring an immediate ambulance. No fracture appeared, but the fall changed the safety plan. A home health aide would come each morning. A bedside commode would be delivered. The stair door would stay locked unless someone accompanied him. Walter rejected all three. "Then tell me your plan," Eli said. "I won't fall again." "That's a wish. I asked for a plan. You people have a piece of equipment for every indignity. We have equipment that may let you stay in this apartment instead of going to an inpatient unit after an avoidable injury. I know none of it feels like winning." Walter looked toward the stairs. "I built those steps. I know. 44 inches wide, oak treads. Miriam carried Daniel up them the day we brought him home." Eli sat across from him. "And now your body is changing. The stairs aren't an exam you failed." Walter turned his face away. The argument lasted nearly an hour, but the solution came from Mrs. Alvarez. She offered to unlock the shop each afternoon so Walter could sit downstairs for an hour if he felt well enough and someone was with him. Noah, her college-age nephew, would help bring a sturdy chair from storage. Walter could still enter the place he had built without gambling his life on a private trip down the stairs. Walter agreed to the aid only after learning the first assigned aide was a man named Raymond, who had spent 20 years laying tile before caring for his own brother. He accepted the commode after Eli promised to call it a chair and never use the manufacturer's cheerful product name. The next Monday, Raymond arrived at 8. Walter made him rehang a crooked cabinet door before allowing him to prepare breakfast. Raymond did it, then informed Walter that home health aide duties did not include free carpentry and charged him 1 cup of coffee. By the end of the week, they were arguing amiably about grout. The fall left more than a bruise. It made Walter tired in a way sleep did not correct. He began using the hospital bed for afternoon rests, though he insisted on calling it the adjustable cot. Eli saw the borders of Walter's world drawing inward. First, the store closed. Then the stairs became unsafe. Then the distance from recliner to kitchen required thought. Hospice did not promise to stop that narrowing. It promised that Walter would remain a person inside it. One afternoon, Priya brought a small digital recorder at Walter's request. Legacy work was optional, she explained. Some patients wrote letters, recorded memories, labeled photographs, or created recipes for family. Others wanted none of it. Walter said the word legacy sounded like a bank advertising campaign. "Then call it inventory," Priya said. That he understood. They began with the photographs on the piano. Walter identified grandparents, cousins, old employees, and customers nobody else would know. He described Miriam's yellow dress in one picture and the terrible punch served at their wedding. He identified the Little League boy as Daniel, age 10, shortstop, unable to hit a curveball but unwilling to admit it. At the high school graduation photograph, Walter stopped. "He built his first guitar at 16, he said after a while. "Not from a kit. Maple neck, mahogany body. Used my bandsaw without permission." "Was it good?" Priya asked. The wiring hummed. The intonation was wrong above the 12th fret. She waited. It was very good for 16. Walter told the recorder how Daniel had spent a summer in the back of the hardware store, sanding the body after closing. Miriam sewed a cloth cover for the finished instrument. Walter ordered better tuning machines from a supplier and left them on the bench without a note. "Did he know they were from you?" Priya asked. "Who else would order tuning machines wholesale? Did you tell him you were proud?" Walter reached toward the recorder and switched it off. Priya did not turn it on again. That evening, Eli found Walter studying the graduation picture. The oxygen cannula rested beneath his nose, and the concentrator hummed from the hall. He knew, Walter said. Eli set down his bag. About the tuning machines? That I was proud. Maybe. Walter disliked the answer. I paid attention. You did. I gave him the good workbench. That sounds like something you would understand as love. It was love. I believe you. Walter's voice sharpened. Then why are we discussing it as if it were encrypted? Eli sat and let the question settle between them. Because people can receive love and still need words. Both things can be true. Walter looked at Daniel's young face for so long that Eli began preparing medication in silence. Miriam used to say that, Walter said. She sounds irritatingly perceptive. It was exhausting. The recorder remained on the table for 3 days. On the 4th, Walter asked Raymond to press the red button and leave the room. He recorded for 11 minutes. Nobody listened then. He sealed the memory card in an envelope marked Daniel, if located. Beneath the name, he added, "No music at funeral unless competently performed." The envelope changed the question. Before it existed, finding Daniel had been an abstract possibility. Now there was something Walter wanted delivered and no address to receive it. Still, he hesitated. He asked Priya what would happen if Daniel wanted money. She explained that contact did not alter Walter's will, power of attorney, or control of the building. He could involve his attorney if needed. He asked what happened if Daniel arrived angry. Priya said visits could begin by phone, could occur with staff present, and could stop at Walter's request. He asked what would happen if Daniel did not answer. Priya did not soften the truth. Then we help you carry that answer. Walter sent her away after that, but he apologized before she reached the stairs. The apology was so awkward that Priya almost missed it. I am aware your statement was factually appropriate, he said. My response exceeded what was necessary. Accepted, she said. That is not the same as saying it was fine. No, it isn't. Walter nodded, apparently relieved that apologies could be accepted without rewriting the event. The midpoint of their time together arrived on a warm afternoon when Eli wheeled Walter downstairs. It was the first time Walter had entered the hardware store since enrolling in hospice. Mrs. Alvarez unlocked the front door, and sunlight cut through the dusty air in long gold bars. Most shelves were bare, but handwritten labels remained. Fasteners, plumbing, electrical, keys. The counter showed pale circles where jars of washers had once stood. Walter sat in the wheelchair with one blanket over his knees and surveyed the room like an owner arriving before opening. His breathing was shallow from the trip down, but the oxygen cylinder rested discreetly behind the chair. They took the brass screws, he said. Mrs. Alvarez looked alarmed. Who did? The auction company. I told them to leave one drawer. Eli checked beneath the counter. A shallow wooden drawer remained, pushed all the way back. Inside were 14 brass screws, 2 cabinet knobs, a broken tape measure, and a small key in a paper envelope. Walter asked for the envelope. The handwriting on it was younger and less rigid than his present hand. Dan's case. Guitar case, he said. He had cut the key when Daniel was 17, after the original snapped in a bus station lock. Daniel left the replacement behind when he went to Nashville, perhaps by accident. Walter placed it in the drawer, intending to mail it. Then Miriam got sick, and the key became too small a subject for the anger around it. 23 years, Walter said, for a key to a case he probably doesn't own. Eli leaned against the counter. Things wait when people do. Walter turned the key over in his palm. That sounded like a greeting card. A poor one? Very. He asked to sit behind the counter. From there he could see the green front door, the worn place in the floor where customers had stood, and the back workbench where Daniel built the guitar. Dust lay over it, but shallow marks from clamps remained along the edge. Walter began telling Eli how the store sounded on Saturday mornings. The bell over the door, the key grinder, Miriam opening paper bags, Daniel testing guitar chords in back when he was supposed to sweep. As he spoke, the empty room repopulated around him. Then the front door shifted in a draft, and its bell gave one small ring. Walter stopped. His hand closed around the key. "I thought keeping the building meant I had not lost everything," he said. "But I kept it empty." Eli did not tell him the building could still be filled. Hope offered too early can feel like an assignment. Walter looked at the old workbench. He might not want the key. Then it remains a key. And if he does, then you know where it is. Back upstairs, the trip exhausted him. He slept until evening with the envelope in his shirt pocket. When he woke, he asked Eli the question he had been approaching for weeks. "You aren't going to tell me time is short." "You know time is short." Priya says unresolved relationships can create emotional distress. Priya also says you control who enters your room. Walter adjusted the blanket over his knees. "What would you do?" It was the first personal question he had asked. Eli considered lying. Professional boundaries sometimes became a wall built from true rules for false reasons. "My father died before I could decide what our last conversation should be. For a while, I thought that gave me expertise. It didn't. It gave me a regret that belongs to me. Yours belongs to you." Walter looked down at his hands. Cancer had thinned them, making the knuckles prominent. These were hands that had measured lumber, cut keys, repaired lamps, stocked shelves, and once held a baby Daniel in the photograph on the piano. "If we found him," Walter said, "he might hang up. He might. He might have a family that knows nothing about me. He might. He might be dead. Yes. You are remarkably poor at reassurance. I can reassure you that you won't have to do anything alone. I can't promise what another person will do." Walter was quiet for the length of one song playing low on the turntable. "Find him," he said. Eli did not reach for his phone. "Tell Priya that when she comes tomorrow. She knows the consent forms and search resources. We'll do it carefully. You could simply look on the internet. I could also violate your privacy, contact the wrong person, or put information where you didn't intend it. We do this carefully." Walter gave a faint nod. Annoying. That's why we have professionals. Priya returned Friday. Walter signed permission for the hospice team to help locate Daniel and to disclose only limited information if they found him. Walter was ill. Walter had requested contact, and Daniel could choose whether and how to respond. No diagnosis details without further consent. No surprise visit. No pressure. The first search found too many Daniel Bells. The second found an old musician credit attached to a band called Northbound Mile. The band had released one independent album, toured regional clubs, and dissolved more than 2 decades earlier. A grainy photograph showed 4 young men beside a van. Walter identified Daniel at once. He still had Miriam's eyes, he said. Priya traced the old record label to a producer in Tennessee, then to a songwriting association listing for a Daniel W. Bell. The mailing address was no longer current. A professional networking page suggested he repaired and restored stringed instruments near Asheville, North Carolina. There was a shop called Bell Tone Guitar Repair. Its website showed a workbench, rows of clamps, and a pair of older hands shaping a bridge. No face appeared. The biography said the owner had toured when he was young, preferred workshop dust to stage smoke, and lived in the mountains with his wife, Lena. Walter read the page 3 times. "He repairs things," he said. Eli heard what he meant. Daniel had not become entirely unrecognizable after all. Priya sent a brief email to the business address. She identified herself as a hospice social worker and asked Daniel to call regarding a confidential family matter. Then everyone waited. Waiting changed Walter. He pretended it did not, but Eli saw him look toward the phone whenever a truck changed gears on the street below. The crossword suffered. On Monday, Walter wrote an answer into the wrong row and did not notice for several minutes. "This was a mistake," he said. "Send another email. Tell him never mind." "Priya won't chase him, and she won't retract your request without talking to you." "I have talked." "You've panicked. It sounds similar, but the paperwork is different." Walter dropped the pen on the table. "You enjoy this." "Deeply." The call came Tuesday at 4:17. Priya was in another home when her hospice phone displayed a North Carolina number. She stepped onto the porch and answered. A man said, "This is Daniel Bell. You emailed me about my father." His voice was cautious and flat, the voice of someone who had spent years imagining bad news and was angry at himself for being surprised. Priya confirmed his identity with information Walter had provided. She told him Walter was seriously ill and had asked to know whether Daniel would accept contact. Daniel did not speak for a long time. "How long?" he asked. "We can't predict exactly, likely weeks rather than months, but I need Walter's permission before I share more medical detail." "Does he know you called me?" "He asked us to find you." Another silence. "Did he say why?" "He said he wanted the choice to be yours." That was not the whole emotional truth, but it was true enough to leave room. Daniel asked for one night to think. Priya said yes. She did not tell him he might regret waiting. Hospice work had taught her that urgency and coercion could wear the same coat. She called Walter and reported only what Daniel had agreed she could report. He was alive, he had received the message, and he would respond tomorrow. Walter said, "Fine," then called Eli 5 minutes later to ask whether nausea could be caused by social workers. "Almost certainly," Eli said. "Take the medication anyway." Daniel called the next morning. He was 46 now. He and Lena had been married 19 years. They had no children. Information he offered without being asked, perhaps because he knew his father would wonder. He had kept the first Christmas card Walter returned. He did not know whether he wanted to visit. "Would you speak to him by phone?" Priya asked. "I don't know what I would say." "You can decide after you hear his voice. You can also choose not to call." "Does he expect forgiveness?" "He hasn't used that word." Daniel laughed once, without humor. That sounds like him. Priya arranged a call for Thursday afternoon. She offered to be present in Walter's apartment, but Walter refused. Then he asked Eli to come early, without explaining why. Eli arrived at 1. Walter had shaved, changed into a blue button-down shirt, and completed half a crossword with obvious errors. On the turntable waited Kind of Blue. "Too obvious?" he asked. "Only if you plan to hold the phone against the speaker." Walter nearly changed the album. Eli persuaded him to leave it. At 1:45, Walter began rehearsing possible openings. "Hello, Daniel" sounded absurd. "Son" sounded presumptuous. "I'm sorry" sounded like a trap if delivered before Daniel had spoken. "What do normal people say?" Walter asked. "Mostly hello." Useless profession. Eli set the phone on the coffee table, checked that the volume was high enough, and moved his chair toward the kitchen. Walter told him not to leave the room. Eli stayed where Walter could see him, but not close enough to make the call feel observed. At 2 exactly, the phone rang. Walter stared at it through the first ring. On the second, he lifted the receiver. "Hello?" A voice answered, too faint for Eli to make out. Walter closed his eyes. "Daniel." Another pause. "Yes," Walter said. "It's me." For the first several minutes they spoke about facts because facts were safe. Walter's diagnosis, Daniel's shop, the weather in Asheville, the fact that the hardware store had closed, the fact that the building remained. Each man sounded like a clerk confirming an order. Then Daniel asked, "Why now?" Walter's grip tightened on the receiver. Eli looked toward the window, offering privacy. Rain had begun again, light against the glass. "Because I am dying," Walter said. Daniel's answer came louder. Eli heard it clearly. "That's not what I asked." Walter flinched. He could have defended himself. Eli saw the old machinery begin. Precision, pride, the quick discovery of another person's weakest sentence. For 23 years, that machinery had kept Walter safe from one conversation and imprisoned him inside it. Walter looked at the unfinished crossword. His pen rested across the empty center squares. "Because I was wrong," he said. Nothing came from the phone. Walter continued. "Not about everything. I don't know how to be wrong about everything at once, but I was wrong to send your card back. I was wrong to ask what you wanted when you called. I was wrong to make your mother's illness into an account we were settling against each other. And I was wrong when I told you to leave." Daniel's voice cracked. "You said I killed her." Walter went white. The room held still around him. Even the turntable had reached the quiet space between tracks. "I know," Walter said. "You did not. Cancer killed her. I said the cruelest thing I could find because you had found one first, and I wanted to win. I won. You left." On the other end, Daniel was crying or breathing hard. Eli could not tell. Walter's own eyes filled, but his voice remained steady. "I am sorry, Daniel." There is no explanation attached to that sentence. The call did not become easy. Daniel did not offer instant absolution. He told Walter what the returned Christmas card had done to him. Walter listened. Daniel said he had driven north after the store closed and parked across the street for an hour without going in. Walter gripped the phone and listened. They spoke for 38 minutes. At the end, Daniel said, "I need time." Walter replied, "I understand." Then Daniel said, "I'll call Sunday." After the line went quiet, Walter kept the receiver against his ear. Eli waited. Finally, Walter set it down and said, "I had prepared several intelligent observations. I'm glad you spared him." Walter looked toward the record player. "Turn it over." Eli turned the album to side 2. They listened without speaking. Halfway through, Walter picked up the pen and corrected the answers he had put in the wrong places. That was not reconciliation. It was a door unlocked after 23 years. Doors still require someone to cross the room. Daniel called Sunday, then Tuesday. The first conversations stayed short. Walter asked too many questions about the guitar shop and not enough about Lena. Daniel interpreted every pause as judgment. Once, Walter corrected Daniel's memory of Miriam's pie crust, and they nearly turned nostalgia into another courtroom. Eli helped only when asked. "Are you trying to remember her together," he said, "or establish who loved her more accurately?" Walter called that an offensive question. The next time Daniel remembered a song differently, Walter let the difference stand. Lena joined one call. She had a warm laugh and told Walter that Daniel kept every tool sharpened beyond reason. Walter said that was the first reassuring thing he had heard. Daniel accused them of forming an alliance. The record player became part of the calls. Walter played Miriam's favorites and held the phone where Daniel could hear. Daniel found his own copy of the Northbound Mile album and mailed it north. The cover showed him at 22, still the thin boy with the patched guitar case, standing at the edge of the group as if ready to leave the photograph. Inside the package was a note. Track 4 was the one Mom liked. You said you never heard it. Walter asked Eli to put the record on. The song was quieter than Walter expected. Daniel sang harmony beneath another voice, but the guitar line was his, patient and clean. Halfway through, a melody appeared that Walter recognized from Miriam humming at the kitchen sink. "He wrote this?" Walter asked. The album notes credited Daniel Bell. Walter listened twice. Then he asked for paper. His hand had begun to tremble, so the letter took most of the afternoon. He did not ask Eli what to write. He told Daniel the guitar part was beautiful. He said Miriam had known something he had refused to learn. He said he was sorry he had not listened when listening was still simple. He signed it Dad, stared at the word, crossed it out, and signed Walter. Then he crossed that out too and wrote Dad again. Daniel called when the letter arrived. "I'm coming," he said. Walter's first response was practical. "It's an 8-hour drive." "Closer to 7.5. "Not if you stop." "I know how roads work." "Apparently not if you're planning this on a Friday." Daniel laughed. Walter did too, and for one brief instant the years between them sounded thin. The visit was set for the following Wednesday. Lena would come. They booked a room at the inn near the river because Walter's apartment had no suitable guest room, and because everyone understood, without saying it, that too much closeness could make fragile peace collapse under its own weight. Walter prepared as if for an inspection. He asked Mrs. Alvarez to dust the record cabinet, though it was already clean. He made Eli move the hospital bed farther into the side room. He rejected 3 shirts before choosing the same blue one he had worn for the first call. Then his condition worsened. It happened over one weekend. His skin yellowed. He slept through most of Saturday and woke confused Sunday morning, asking why the store had not opened. The hospice nurse on call visited, assessed him, adjusted medication, and called Daniel with Walter's permission. Daniel moved the trip to Monday. Snow began overnight, late and heavy for the season in the higher elevations south of Pittsburgh. Daniel and Lena left before dawn. A crash closed part of the interstate, and the navigation app added 2 hours, then 3. Walter drifted in and out. When awake, he asked the time and said he was not waiting for anybody. Eli arrived before noon and stayed beyond his scheduled visit because symptoms were changing and because Walter's fear had become visible at last. "He'll think I waited too long again," Walter murmured. "He knows you're here. He knows the road is closed." "Not the road. Everything." Eli sat beside the hospital bed, now positioned near the windows. "You did wait too long. So did he. And then you both stopped waiting. That's the part happening now." Walter's eyes closed. "You make poor greeting cards." "I've been told." At 3, Daniel called from traffic. Eli held the phone near Walter's ear. Daniel said they were moving again. Walter tried to answer, but his voice failed. Eli moistened his mouth with a sponge and adjusted the medicine for breathlessness. "Don't make him talk," Daniel said through the phone. "Just tell him we're coming." Eli told him. The snow turned to rain near the state line. By 5, the apartment had darkened. Mrs. Alvarez switched on lamps and brought soup nobody ate. Priya arrived, then quietly left when she saw the symptoms were controlled and Walter had enough company. At 6:12, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Daniel came through the door carrying no coat, though snowmelt darkened his shoulders. He was tall like Walter, with Miriam's eyes and gray in his beard. Lena followed a few steps behind and closed the door softly. For a second, Daniel stopped. 23 years had prepared him for anger, imagined speeches, and the possibility of arriving too late. Nothing had prepared him for his father, made small beneath a quilt, one hand resting beside an unfinished crossword. Walter opened his eyes. "You need a haircut," he whispered. Daniel made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. He crossed the room, sat beside the bed, and took Walter's hand. "Traffic," he said. "Excuse." "You look terrible, too." "Cancer. Better excuse." Those were their first words face to face. Eli moved toward the kitchen, but Walter tightened his other hand around Eli's wrist. "Stay until the record." Daniel looked at him. "What record?" "Your mother's." Lena found kind of blue on top of the cabinet. Daniel lifted the plastic cover and inspected the turntable with the automatic care of a craftsman. He cleaned the stylus using the small brush Eli had brought weeks before, placed the record, and lowered the needle. The familiar crackle filled the room. "Still sounds like arguing through a drain pipe," Daniel said. Walter smiled. "No soul." "Mom said I might grow one." "Did you?" Daniel held his father's hand. "Some." Eli stayed through the first track, then asked Lena if she knew how to reach the hospice number and where the medication schedule lay. She did. Daniel stood and followed him to the door. "Are we doing this right?" he asked quietly. Eli looked back at Walter, who had closed his eyes while the trumpet moved gently through the room. "There isn't a right version. Keep him comfortable. Say what is true. Let silence do some of the work. Call us before you think you need us." Daniel nodded. "Thank you for finding me." "Your father asked. Priya found you. You came. Keep the credit where it belongs." Eli left his shoes on the mat until he reached the bottom stair, then went back for them because Walter would have objected. Daniel and Lena stayed at the apartment that night. Walter slept, woke, spoke a few sentences, and slept again. The snow stopped. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement below the windows. Near midnight, Walter woke clear-minded. Daniel sat beside him doing the crossword from that morning. 14 across is épée, Walter said. "It doesn't fit." "Then you misspelled 9 down." Daniel checked. He had. They worked slowly. Walter could no longer hold the pen steadily, so Daniel wrote. At 26 down, the clue read, "Something restored," 5 letters. Daniel suggested, "Trust." Walter counted the squares. 5. "Trust is 5. I know. I was confirming the editor had managed it. Daniel wrote the word. In the early hours, Walter told him where the building documents were kept and which contractor had repaired the roof. Daniel said they could discuss business later. Walter said later was an imprecise unit. Then he told Daniel the hardware store would go to him, not as an obligation and not as a test. If Daniel wanted to sell it, he should sell. If he wanted to expose the brick and charge $6 for coffee, Walter would return and cause plumbing trouble. Daniel promised nothing except to consider the plumbing risk. Before dawn, he asked the question he had carried from North Carolina. "Did Mom know you told me to leave?" Walter looked toward the paling window. "No." She was already gone. Would she have forgiven you? Your mother could forgive almost anything. That did not make everything forgivable. Daniel lowered his head. Walter gathered enough breath. She knew I loved you. She also knew I was bad at letting love remain love when I was afraid. I made it into instructions. You wanted me safe. I wanted you safe in a life I understood. That is not the same thing. Daniel rested their joined hands on the quilt. I should have come back. Yes. Daniel looked up, startled. Walter's eyes held a trace of the old sharpness. You should have. And I should have called. We can both be sorry without measuring whose portion weighs more. That was the closest they came to forgiveness as a formal declaration. It was enough. Walter lived 5 more days. The days were not a cinematic farewell. They were physical and ordinary. Medicine every few hours, mouth care. Sheets changed after sweat. Calls to hospice when breathing altered. Lena warmed soup and made coffee. Mrs. Alvarez brought clean towels. Daniel slept in the recliner with his feet on the walnut table Walter had insisted nobody move. Eli visited each day. He taught Daniel how to help without pulling Walter's arms, how to read signs of discomfort when speech faded, and why reduced eating was part of the body's natural process rather than a failure of care. He repeated that nobody had to force food. He reminded them to rest. On the second day, Daniel brought his old acoustic guitar from the car. It was not the patched touring guitar. That one had been sold long ago to pay rent. This instrument had a warm cedar top and a nick beside the bridge. He played quietly in the afternoon. Walter seemed asleep, but when Daniel stopped, his fingers moved against the quilt. Again, he whispered. Daniel played track 4 from the Northbound Mile album, the song Miriam had loved. Without drums or another singer, the melody sounded like something that had always belonged in the apartment. Walter breathed in time with it. On the 3rd day, he was awake long enough to ask for the crossword. Daniel read clues aloud. Walter answered 2, rejected 4 as poorly written, and fell asleep during a complaint about abbreviations. On the 4th, he spoke only once. Eli was adjusting the pillow when Walter opened his eyes and said, "Pen." Daniel put the blue pen in his hand. Walter could not grip it. Daniel closed Walter's fingers around it and held them there for a moment. On the 5th morning, rain returned. The room was quiet except for the record turning. Kind of Blue had reached the end of side 2, and the needle made a soft, repeating sound in the final groove. Daniel sat on one side of the bed, Lena on the other. Eli had arrived 20 minutes earlier after Daniel called about a change in breathing. Eli listened, assessed, and told them gently that Walter was very close. He gave medication for comfort and lowered the lights. Daniel leaned near his father's ear. "We're here," he said. "You don't have to wait." Walter's breathing slowed. There was a pause long enough that everyone thought it had stopped, then one final, quiet breath. Eli checked for a heartbeat and watched the clock because the law and the chart required a time even when the room did not. He pronounced Walter dead at 9:14 in the morning. Nobody moved immediately. The needle continued its soft, circular whisper. Then Daniel stood and lifted it from the record. Hospice death procedures were calm and deliberate. Eli called the physician, notified the funeral home Walter had chosen, disposed of medications according to policy with Daniel witnessing, and explained what would happen next. He gave the family time before anyone came upstairs. Daniel sat at the table and looked at the unfinished crossword. Trust remained at 26 down in his handwriting. Across it, several empty answers would never be filled. He hated unfinished puzzles, Daniel said. Eli closed the newspaper gently. Maybe this one did what it came to do. Daniel looked at him. That's sentimental and unsupported by crossings. Eli laughed. So did Daniel, and then Daniel cried until he could not speak. The funeral was held 4 days later in a small brick church. Walter had requested no open casket, no elaborate flowers, and no description of him as beloved by all, because, as his written instructions noted, accuracy should survive the deceased. People came from the years of the hardware store: plumbers, carpenters, homeowners whose keys Walter had cut, children who had once bought a single nail for a school project and been treated like serious customers. Mrs. Alvarez spoke about his habit of clearing her sidewalk before dawn, while later denying he owned a snow shovel. Daniel played guitar. He chose the song Miriam had loved. He did not tell the room the whole story. Reconciliation was not a performance they owed anyone. He said only that his father had been a difficult man who maintained tools, buildings, grudges, and eventually a record player with equal attention. Then he said they had found their way back before time ran out, and he was grateful to the people who helped keep the door open. Eli sat in the last pew beside Priya. Hospice workers did not attend every funeral. If they did, grief would occupy every weekend. But some patients became part of the map inside you, a place you could revisit without confusing it for home. After the service, Daniel handed Eli the blue pen. He had 3 exactly like it, Eli said. This is the one he used on your first crossword together. He labeled the cap with the date. Of course he had. Eli accepted it. Here's the update. Daniel inherited the hardware building and spent 6 months deciding what to do. Developers made offers. One proposed luxury apartments. Another wanted the exposed brick and expensive coffee Walter had predicted. Daniel and Lena did not move north permanently, but they kept the building. They hired a local manager and reopened the ground floor as a community workshop called Bell's Bench. Half the space held shared tools and evening repair classes. The other half became a small storefront where local craftspeople sold practical things: cutting boards, repaired lamps, hand tools restored rather than discarded. There was coffee, but it cost $2, and the brick remained respectfully covered in plaster. Daniel set up his father's old key machine near the front counter. Above it, he hung the Northbound Mile album beside a photograph of Miriam laughing on her wedding day. The walnut record cabinet stayed upstairs, and once each month, Daniel drove from North Carolina to work a weekend at the bench. The first class taught people how to repair a loose chair. The second covered lamp wiring. The third was called Fix What You Can, a title Lena chose before Daniel noticed the double meaning. Mrs. Alvarez attended every class and corrected the instructors. Eli continued hospice nursing. He did not become a miraculous finder of lost relatives, because most endings do not arrange themselves that neatly. Some patients chose no contact. Some families said no. Some searches ended with an address and no answer. He honored those endings too. But Walter changed one part of his practice. When a chart said estranged family, Eli no longer treated the phrase as a closed door or an invitation to push. He treated it as a question that belonged entirely to the patient. Is there anyone you want us to try to find, knowing the answer may be no? Sometimes that question brought relief simply because the patient was allowed to refuse it. A year after Walter died, Eli visited Bell's Bench on a rainy Thursday. Daniel was upstairs tuning the old turntable after replacing a worn cable. On the work table lay a newspaper crossword, half completed in blue ink. Pen? Eli asked. Daniel nodded. He was right. Pencil encourages moral weakness. They sat near the windows and worked through the clues. Daniel had inherited Walter's impatience with question marks and his habit of pressing too hard when uncertain. Eli had kept the blue pen in his work bag until the lettering on the cap began to fade. At 17 across, the clue read, "One who remains," 6 letters. Eli remembered the puzzle from his second visit. Keeper. Daniel counted the boxes. 6. He wrote it in. Downstairs, a teenager was learning to replace a guitar string. Mrs. Alvarez was showing a young couple how to use a level. Rain made soft tracks down the storefront windows, and from the record cabinet came the first notes of an album once bought to make a one-chair apartment sound sophisticated. Walter had not become easy before he died. Daniel had not forgotten 23 years because of 5 days. Forgiveness did not erase the returned card, the birthdays and holidays missed, or the sentence spoken in anger in the hardware store after Miriam's funeral. What changed was smaller and, perhaps, more honest. They stopped using the past to prevent the next true sentence. Walter said he was sorry without attaching a defense. Daniel came without demanding a perfect father be waiting. For 5 days, they let love remain love instead of turning it into instructions or evidence. The crossword from Walter's last morning is framed upstairs at Belle's bench. Most visitors assume it is unfinished. Daniel knows better. At 26 down, in his handwriting, is the word trust. Several answers around it remain blank. The paper does not explain that trust arrived late, that it had to cross a closed interstate in snow, or that an old man who wrote everything in pen finally admitted he had been wrong. It only gives the word enough squares. So let the rain move beyond your window now. Let the record turn softly in another room. Somewhere, a lamp has been repaired instead of thrown away. Somewhere, a son is teaching a stranger how to mend the cracked guitar bridge at the workbench his father left him. And somewhere in a nurse's bag is a blue pen labeled with the date 2 stubborn men began to find each other again. If this story stayed with you, you can leave a like and subscribe for the next one. Before you drift off, tell me what you think. When years of silence have passed, is it better to risk one difficult call, or can leaving the door closed sometimes be the kinder choice? Share your state and age, too. I like knowing who is listening tonight. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next story.